The film, to me, is the perfect meeting point of auteur cinema and popular cinema.
Hello, everybody. My name is Ron, and welcome to Why This Film, a podcast where we explore the artistry, cultural impact, and legacy of movies in the Criterion Collection. Each episode, I sit down with experts and cinephiles to ask, why was this film chosen for the collection, and why does it still matter today? In this episode, we're stepping into the smoke-filled world of Jacques Becker's Touchez, Grisbi, which translates to Don't Touch the Loot. Part of the Criterion Collection as spine number 271, we simply refer to it as Grisbi. Released in 1954, it's a gangster story shaped by friendship and aging, where the usual action is replaced with everyday routines and the enduring friendship between the characters Max and Riton. Joining me is Ginette Vincendeau, a scholar and author whose work has shaped how we see French cinema. She is Professor Emeritus of Film Studies at King's College London, Co-Chief General Editor of French Screen Studies, and she was honored by the French Ministry of Culture for her services to French culture. A regular contributor to Sight and Sound and a writer for the BFI, Arrow Films, and the Criterion Collection, she has helped audiences around the world rediscover the depth and artistry of classic French cinema. Her work includes a forthcoming co-edited volume on Agnes Varda, as well as a new BFI Classics monograph on Godard's Le Maître. And of course, her book, Jean Gabin, Anatomy of a Myth, remains the definitive study of Gabin's scream persona, making her the perfect guest to help us unpack Grisbi. And with that, here is my conversation with Ginette. I had not seen this or even heard of this film before. Don't let that hurt you too much that I've not heard of it. But why was it on the list that you originally sent me? You said it was a favorite of yours.
Well, a few reasons. The main reason is the star Jean Gabin, because I'm very fond of him and I've written the book about him and I think it is one of his best roles. I mean, there are many others. And then it's also a film that is very important in the history of French cinema of the 1950s. It was a very successful popular film as well as also an auteur film because it's made by Jacques Becker, who is a great filmmaker. So it's kind of meeting point of the popular cinema and auteur cinema. And I like that about it. And the more I see it, the more I like it. So I never tire of it. There are 2 or 3 particular scenes I like. And last May, I had a little celebration for my retirement from teaching at King's College. I did it at the British Film Institute in London. And they asked me if I would introduce a film before the party as such that my colleagues had organized. And I said yes. And they said, can you suggest some films? And I suggested a number of them. And Grisbi was one of them. And they chose that. And so it was a great occasion because it enabled me to make a joke, at least about in my introduction, which was that it's also a film about somebody who wants to retire. I've had enough, and I thought this was my last big job and, I have to carry on. And also I said, if retirement means that you're in a lovely flat in Paris and your fridge is full of foie gras and champagne, I'm okay with that. So
we'll get into the specific scenes. Yes, but he does open the fridge at one point, and it is just chock full of champagne.
Yes. Now, I really love that because he opens it, and all you see are half bottles of champagne, which he clearly, is his daily intake. So I really like that.
I want to get into our director and the lead actor, Jean Gabin. I finished my 3rd watch just this morning, thinking more about his pre-war, post-war career. And so last night I watched Pepe Le Moco for the first time and I really enjoyed it. But then watching this morning, I can see the tired weariness of him. It's his character, but also him. So I was curious if you could, I know this could be a very long answer, but if you could do it briefly of just getting into his career pre and post-war. Because he did serve in was it the Navy? He served in the Navy?
Well, yes, at one point. So he started, Jean Gabin, he was born, in the early 20th century, and he started making films with the coming of sound. He was a singer, a cabaret singer before that, briefly. And then quite quickly, he became a film actor, starting in 1929, 1930. And he became a big star quite relatively quickly in 1935 with a film called La Bandera, which is a film about soldiers. And whereas when you look at the first years of his career, he's playing sort of rather comic parts or, jolly films, musicals and things like that. And then with La Bandera, there's a sudden switch to drama, to a tragic film where he dies at the end. And that sort of began a run of films that goes from about 1935 to the war, 1940, where he becomes a kind of emblematic working class regular man who is pushed to crime, to committing a crime, or else he's a criminal who is, deep down is a good guy. So there's this kind of extraordinary ability to be both the guy next door and an outlaw, a tragic figure, a criminal. And all his films of that great period of French cinema as well, between 35 and the war, feature him as that kind of proletarian hero, but he's also the guy next door. And he was, at the time, he was often compared to either James Cagney in Hollywood or Spencer Tracy a bit later. So there's kind of regular guys, but also who have a kind of extraordinary charisma but can also be tragic figures. So it kind of rolled all these characters into one. And then there's a break with the war. He decided not to stay in occupied France and went to Hollywood, where he made 2 films. He wasn't particularly happy there, except in his private life, because he got together with Marlene Dietrich and they had a passionate relationship. But he wanted to join the resistance, and he did. So he crossed the Atlantic in a submarine and then joined the liberation armies. But that break, which is obviously was a kind of glorious record to some extent as a resistant figure, marked also a break in his career and took him a little bit of time after the war to get back to the status he'd had before the war. And there's that second half of the 1930s, he really was the biggest male star, and then took him a few years to regain that status. And Touchez, Grisbi, the Jacques Becker film of 1954, is often credited, I think quite rightly, with the film that brings him back to this kind of star status. And then from then on, more or less until the 1970s when he died, he just made an enormous amount of films and remained a huge star. But the official version, if you like, of his trajectory, which is not mine, is that there was a good Gabin of the pre-war period in those great classics, films by Jean Renoir and like La Grande Illusion or Marcel Cardet, etc. And then there is the more commercial Gabin of the post-war period, where he plays more bourgeois figures, older men, often members of sort of rich families or gangster. So I personally think that there's much more continuity between the pre-war and the post-war. Obviously, you can see that he's aging and he's changing. He becomes a more mature figure. Also, he aged visibly quite quickly between that pre-war and post-war era. But I think there is that continuity, that you still have that proletarian figure inside those bourgeois characters or those godfather figures, as in Grisbi.
You mentioned Spencer Tracy and James Cagney. I was watching this morning and I got a little Humphrey Bogart, a little bit of that charisma from him in this latest watch. And you said earlier that you like it more and more. I feel the exact same way. I've finished this watch today and it's like, oh, he is just so charismatic and cool.
Yeah.
You can watch it just for him. He's just such a really fun person to watch on screen.
Yes. You mentioned James Cagney and Bogart as well. I think what they share also, which is a sense of authenticity, which is embedded in a kind of very minimalist performance. So, and there was always the sense that Gabin was not acting. You also have to remember when he emerged in the 30s in France, you had a lot of actors who were from the theater, who were kind of well-trained actors of a particular kind. And Gabin was a rougher and more minimalist figure, and therefore appears more authentic. And there was that sense that this proletarian character you saw on screen was really Gabin. And he spoke the right way and he moved the right way. In actual fact, of course, he wasn't really from a proletarian background. His parents were in show business, in fact. But there is that sense of authenticity, which I think is really allied to charisma, which makes him such a mesmerizing actor.
He has a quiet confidence to him, too. Like, when he walks into the room, especially in Grisbi, you can just sense that he has... Even when they first walk in the first scene, which we'll get into, when they walk into the restaurant, everybody stops and turns and looks. And he just kind of has that about him.
Yes.
I want to talk a little bit about the director. He was a student of Renoir. He died young.
Yes.
And for people that might not be as familiar, what was Becker to French cinema? He doesn't have that huge body of work that maybe others, when you think of French cinema, he might not have that large body of work that others have.
No, he has a relatively short body of work because he died quite young. He started his career as an assistant to Jean Renoir, and he worked on films like La Grande Illusion. So he knew Jean Gabin already, from that period. And he started making films like a kind of new generation of French filmmakers started during the war, partly under the German occupation, partly because people like Jean Renoir or Duvivier or a lot of the great René Clair, a lot of great French filmmakers decided to emigrate to Hollywood. And Jacques Becker stayed and made his first film during the war, which wasn't particularly well known. But he, at the very end of the war, he made a film called Rendez-vous de Juillet, Rendezvous in July, which was critically well received and is often felt to be a portrait of the young generation that emerged in France after the war. And he carried on making a number of kind of disparate films. But the reason why I think he's remembered so well, even though he had a relatively short career, is that in that short body of work, there were a number of masterpieces. And I think if there is one trait that runs through, is a kind of economical realism. I think, and I think one sees that in Grisbi, that is very economical storytelling. But he's also somebody who was very interested in everyday life, in portraying kind of everyday encounters.
And we're going to see a lot of that.
Yeah, exactly. So, but I think to just mention two great films he made, apart from Grisbi. One would be Casque d'Or. I think it's called Golden Mary in English. And it's set at the turn of the 20th century. And then his last film called Le Trou, which is a prison movie, and which is really extraordinary and really both a very moving film and very tough and very minimalist. So if he'd only made Grisbi, Casque d'Or, and Le Trou, that would be enough to qualify him as a great French filmmaker. Oh, he made a few others. Yeah.
And he adapted this story, Grisbi, from a book, which was apparently quite long, and he really stripped it down. Because the movie's only an hour and 30-ish, hour and 35 minutes or so.
Yes.
And so he really did strip it down to the minimum.
In fact, I think the book, like a number of série noire books that were adapted during the 1950s as thrillers, they're fairly unreadable today, I think. And not because of the slang, but because they're kind of nasty in some ways. I mean, certainly they shock today. They're very misogynist, they're racist, and so on. But when you look at the book Touchez, Grisbi, there's quite also a lot of action. Becker just did away with all that.
Yeah, I'm excited to talk a little bit about those choices in the film.
Yes.
Let's dive into the film itself.
Mm-hmm.
The first two big scenes, they're in the restaurant and they then transition to the burlesque club. In the restaurant and nightclub scenes, we meet everybody that we're going to come across for the most part. I would say 90%. Max, Riton, Josie, Lola, Marco, Madame Bouche, Fats, Ramon, and Angelo. It's about 11 minutes or so, between 11 and 12 minutes. And we get all those characters. We get introduced to all of them.
That's right.
And I appreciate films that don't use exposition to explain everything that's happening. And instead, they kind of use action to catch you up to what's already occurred. So the first thing we see is that newspaper of, hey, this gold was stolen.
Yes.
They don't know who did it. And then the other little subtle things that I like is you come in and everyone turns and looks. Mm-hmm. It's like, these are the important people. Max shoots Lola a look at one point and she looks down. It's like you kind of instantly know who's in charge.
He's the boss. Yeah.
He is the boss.
Totally.
So they are having discussions about, am I going to go to the club or not? I'm tired. He doesn't necessarily want to go. And then he gets up and pays Marco's tab. And I'm glad that you talked about how Becker stripped things away, because he's putting things in by choice that he feels are important to show us these are the important people. So paying Marco's tab, not just paying Marco's tab, he paid Marco's tab and then some. He put a little extra on there. He said, you have a credit here. They get into the car. I think it's Josie that looks like she's going to do drugs, like she's going to
She
snort
does.
drugs.
Yeah, briefly.
Yes,
Yes.
and Breton slaps her for using that. Again, I like films that they're showing you everything you need to know without necessarily telling you what you need to know.
You're right. And I think it's those scenes very economically construct the universe. That you're right that they introduce all the characters, all the important characters are there practically. And then when we go to the club, we meet the owner of the club, who's another great friend of Max. And so we have, the whole cast, as it were, is there. But it's also, I think it's significant that Madame Bouche, the chef at the owner of the restaurant, when other people could try to come in from the outside, she pushes them away and said, no, we're full. And they said,
there's no room for you here. And you're looking around like there's 6 tables sitting there.
And then afterwards she said, well, if I don't do that, then anybody will come in. And so very economically, it shows you that this is the world we're going to explore. And I think it's also, as we said, that Becker stripped away most of the action scenes, including the violence. And what we have is a kind of very cozy universe, which is like a universe within the universe. So this is Mac's gang within Pigalle, which is itself an area of Paris, which at the time certainly was known as the criminal setup. But we never see any other bit of Paris practically. So this is where we are. And when we actually get away from that for a couple of scenes, including, of course, importantly at the end, this is where bad things happen. But when we are in the restaurant, in the nightclub, in Max's apartment, we're safe. And I think what is extraordinary is that it's building up a world which is, to some extent, very much inspired by the American cinema, which is not just like the French book on which it's based, but it's a whole tradition of the American crime film and the heist film, but it's kind of a way of appropriating to French cinema in a French setting. We are in this kind of little village almost, which is Pigalle, and where this is their space, and the rest actually doesn't really matter. And we never see it practically.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think towards the end, he needs to go get the gold back to make the exchange. He says, I'll be there in 10 minutes. And this morning, I thought, is everything just within a 10-block radius of what's going on around them?
This is not just Grisbi, but quite a lot of the French gangster films of that period operate within the same area. You have a great, and some films that are actually, in fact, inspired by Grisbi. So there's a film called Rififi, which was directed by Jules Dassin, American director in Paris. And in 55 and in 56, you have another great French gangster film called Bob le Flambeur, directed by Jean-Pierre Melville. And they're all set within, just a few streets and a few cafes. That's the universe that the films construct as a kind of safe space, which is, of course, ironic. And a little bit later, I'm sure you will recall, when Max goes into an apartment and we see that there are bars on the door, and Riton says, why all this? And he said, well, burglars. And so this is the cozy world that those gangsters inhabit. They're absolutely not terrifying, or it's almost like the violence and the danger have been kind of removed from it.
He has a quote, I relate to it. He says, after midnight, I always feel like I'm doing overtime. And I said, yeah, it's midnight. Yeah. It is feeling like doing overtime.
Yes.
Is this a mirror to Gabin's own aging and weariness at this point in his life, where it's like art imitating life?
Yeah, it's
kind of thing. Am I reading too much into it?
No, I don't think so. I think it's a couple of things. One is, in the story, there is, and of course, it's almost a stereotype of the gangster movie that they're going to do the last big job and then they can retire. So.
And in this one, they've already done the last big job.
So, yeah, if you think of The Asphalt Jungle and sort of some great American films, heist movies, it's always going to be the last job. Automatically, something goes awry and so on. So there is that, but I think it's also, you may know that, amazingly enough for us today, Jacques Becker initially did not want Jean Gabin to play the part. And he wanted a younger actor, because he said he preferred to work with young actors, and also didn't want a star who would be too powerful. He wanted to be more in control. So he'd gone to somebody called Daniel Gélin, who was a very talented younger actor, good looking. And Gélin said to him, you're mad. This is a part for Gabin. You've got to give it to Gabin. Becker didn't agree and went to another actor called François Perrier, also younger. And everybody said, you're mad. It's got to be Gabin. It's a part for Gabin. So eventually he gave it to Gabin. So in a way, it's almost it's fascinating to think what would have happened if he had his way. Probably we would not be talking about it today if it had been one of those younger actors. But the fact that it was Gabin and the character suited so much his personality and also, yes, his age. So it kind of like adds a layer of credibility, I think, to that narrative, which is itself, it's a fairly generic narrative of let's do the last job and retire.
Yes, that is quite the cliche of most movies that you have. Most heist movies are, this is it for me. This is my last big one. I've been working my whole life for this. And he even says that.
Yes.
At one point he says, we've been waiting for this.
Yes.
But the choice to not show it is so fascinating. And I don't even know about something that Variety, when they reviewed the film, it was something about there's not enough action. It's not enough to hold your attention. It was comparing it to American dramas. Well, it's somewhere. It's in one of the essays that came with the Criterion disc. There's two other plot points I want to throw out there before we move on. We see Ramon, he throws the keys to the ambulance. Or I'm sorry, Ramon has thrown the keys. Yeah, Angelo throws Ramon the keys to an ambulance. And it's on a first watch, you're a bit confused.
Yes.
And it's one of those things. It's like, yes, there's not a lot of action going on, but there are actions happening that keep you wondering, I got to get to the next scene so I know what was that about. Max goes to let Lola know that he's leaving. He's had it. He's tired. And he catches Josie smooching it up with Angelo. It made me laugh because when he tells Raton what he saw, he says they were going at it pretty heavy. But when he opens the door, Angelo's just leaning over her. Is this a product of the time, like what they're going to show you on camera versus what Max is telling Raton that he saw? Because he didn't really see them doing anything.
The implication is that they are. Yes. And of course, then Josie, the Jeanne Moreau character, then says, she immediately looks very embarrassed and
basically wants Max to go break up with Raton for her because she just can't she can't face it.
Yes.
So Max leaves the club and we get a little suspense sequence here because Max has a driver and the driver notices that they're being followed and they're being followed by an ambulance.
For sure.
So there's that ambulance coming back. Max uses a little elevator trap. So he runs up the stairs and stops the elevator before it gets to his floor, fires off a shot from his gun to kind of wake up the neighbors and scare them away. He ducks out the back stairs. He's very calm and cool throughout the whole thing. He calls Raton, and even on the phone with him, knowing that Angelo's in the room with Raton, he just remains completely cool. I feel like in a lot of gangster films, basically that I was born in the 80s. So the gangster films I watched, probably inappropriately growing up, were Goodfellas, Casino, basically Scorsese movies. I feel like we get a big shootout here within the first 20 minutes of the film to kind of really set things off. But Becker opts just to show us that Max is smarter than the pursuers. He's outwitting them. Was this a deliberate thing by Becker to go against what the American tropes were? Or is this still back to that idea of I'm stripping things away to show you the minimalist view?
I'm not sure I can answer it, but to say too, it's partly what you say, stripping down, which was Becker's kind of penchant for a kind of minimalist action. It's also, if you look outside Grisbi, a number of gangster films that were made at the same time, especially after, because Grisbi was so successful, that they are very similar, that there's an awful lot of scenes where the gangsters meet in cafes, in restaurants, they eat, they talk. There's not a lot of action. And very often, the most violence you're going to see is Jean Gabin slapping some women, or usually women, but also young men. To me, it's a way in which a French cinema acclimatizes, if you like, kind of imports some features of the American gangster film, but turns them into something that fits within, for example, a more, like Jacques Becker, an interest in the quotidian, everyday life, eating together and stuff like that. So there's a sort of moving away from action cinema. I suspect part of it is also to do with budgets, that it's, these films are made on much smaller budget than their Hollywood counterparts, but also that sense of Paris is an old city, you're in a particular area, and everything happens within 5 minutes of each other. When you watch The Asphalt Jungle, for example, which I watched recently, which is often cited as a very influential American heist films on French cinema, almost the first thing you see wide open spaces and cars and so on. There's a sense of space and distances which you don't have in the French films of that period. I mean, I'm not talking about more recent films, obviously, but in the 1950s. So you tend to have those films are mostly shot indoors, and as you see in Grisbi. So it's typical of Becker, I think. Also, you mentioned Jean Gabin remaining cool, walking slowly is very much part of his performance style, that you practically never see him run or rush. In fact, when he runs up the steps of his flat, it's almost the only time you see him kind of, hurrying somewhere. Usually he's slow, he imposes his rhythm, and that rhythm sort of permeates the whole film. And that may be one reason why Jacques Becker initially wasn't keen on him, because he thought he would impose his own personality on the film, and he does. So I think
you can't take your eyes off of him when he's. I mean,
no,
he's in every scene, but you can't
yeah,
take your because of that calm, cool, collected
yes,
style that he has. You really just can't take your
yes,
eyes off of him. We're about 40 minutes into the film, and then we realize, oh, they pulled the. I mean, because it's a movie, you kind of understand the plot point, but the movie doesn't share with you until about close to 37 minutes that it was Max and Raton who pulled the job for the gold, because
yeah.
he goes and picks up Raton. He's like, you got to get rid of these guys from your apartment. He goes and picks them up, and he takes them to a garage where he has stashed a car that he apparently bought before they did the job to steal all the gold. He's got cases of these big gold bars in the trunk. I think it's 200 pounds of gold bars. So then they're up at Max's apartment. They're going to sit and have snacks and drink it. I don't know what time it is, 1 a.m. Who knows? This is where he learns that Raton told Josie about the job that they pulled. He was worried that she was going to get bored with him.
It's not Riton who told him that he talked to Josie. It's Max who guesses.
Oh, right.
He guesses, and this is another version. Of course, he is completely in charge, and he guesses everything that's happened. And his relationship with Riton, which we must talk about, is very interesting in that respect. So he's the one who says to Riton, "But why? Why did you talk to Josie?" And Riton, of course, think, "Well, how do you know?" So he's guessed because of Josie having, he's joined the dots of the story that we have also as spectators seen.
This is the part where, to a lot of people, this section of the film probably feels really slow, because now we get that, Max works that out.
Yes.
He's kind of got to put this new plan together of how they're going to navigate. I'm assuming his thought is, we're going to sleep on this. Like, we can't make any big rash moves now. We're in a safe spot. We're in a different apartment that he had. It's not his home base, I guess. It's his second space. And this is the stretch of the film that on my first watch I found to be so strange. Just absolutely strange. They're eating. What are they eating? Are they eating foie gras?
Foie gras.
Okay.
Yes.
They're brushing teeth. They're getting out their pajamas. They're getting ready for bed. They're setting up bed. This is a movie about the relationship between these two guys.
Yes.
There's so many little things, and we can get into those as we go. But back at the restaurant, when they leave the restaurant, Josie is going to the back seat, meaning like, oh no, Max and they're going to sit together. They're sitting on the same side of the table in the cafe. They're sitting next to each other. Even with Marco there, they're sitting next to each other in the club. Max is now setting up his friend for a night of sleep. Even at the end, the last big sequence, Fats is in the back, Raton is in the front seat next to Gabin, who's driving. So there's a lot of little things of where they place the characters. It's like, oh, these guys are he has a nickname for him. He calls him Porcupine Head, which I don't know if the translation is accurate or not, but that's the subtitle that I get.
It's sort of hedgehog head. It's
okay.
Yeah. It's
so he's got a little nickname for him. I mean, they've been friends for many years, but the relationship between the two is interesting. But this is the section of the film that first watch I thought, this is weird, because it's not something that you expect to see. It's not something that I have ever seen, where they take all of this time in a movie that is about being efficient and only giving you what's important. They take this long stretch.
Because it is important.
Right. Yes. But why? Why are we spending this much time on these domestic moments between two really good friends?
There are many, this scene is a complete cult scene in among French cinephiles.
Of all the research I did on the film, this is the scene that is popping up in every article I read, in the essays that come with the disc. Like, this is the one that is talked about the most. And I thought, yeah, but they're just brushing teeth. So that was my initial reaction.
A number of points. One is going back to Jacques Becker and his interest in, quotidian life, the sort of intangible little moments of everyday life, that trying to find a kind of realism that can account for those apparently completely unimportant moments, but which for him are important because in this case, for example, about the relationship between those two characters. It's also a kind of, you might say, it's a fairly cliche cultural thing about France and the love of food and so on. And incidentally, I was rereading for today a biography of Gabin, which I hadn't read for a long time. And it reminded me that Gabin himself loved food. And apparently the scene was inspired by a real life fact that most evenings, and this was when the film was made, corresponded to a time when Gabin was single because he'd broken up with Marlene Dietrich. Soon after, would marry his wife and mother of his children. But in between, he would sort of go out every night, practically with a number of his friends, including Paul Francoeur, for example, who plays the owner of the.
Yeah, I think he calls them Fats. Fats Pirot.
Yes, but he has
Perot, I
Polo.
think. Perot, yeah.
So, a number of actors, and so they would. It's not very healthy lifestyle. They would, go and have aperitif in some bars like the Fouquet's on the Champs-Élysées, then go to a very good restaurant and have a big meal, then go to a nightclub and drink more. And around midnight, Gabin was still hungry. So there was a particular bar called L'Étape near the Champs-Élysées where they would go around midnight and the patron would give them little things like foie gras and a glass of wine to round up the evening. And apparently they became famous, the fact that Gabin and his mates would go and eat those sort of this kind of food and drink way into the night. So there is that aspect. Very interestingly, I found when I first taught film in British universities, and before, if you can, you're almost too young to remember a time before DVD and before VHS, where I was teaching then at the University of Warwick. We would teach film on actual print, 35 millimeter prints if we could get them, or 16 mil. And the British 16 mil print of Grisbi was missing that scene when they go and brush their teeth and go to bed in their pajamas.
Wow.
And it was censored. We see them eat the pate and drink the wine. But when in the film, then they suddenly, Gabin says, we must go, let's go to bed. It's late. And then he hands out those, identical pajamas between what he's wearing and
right.
She happens to have a pile of beautifully ironed, obviously silk pajamas. And then they brush their teeth and they go to bed and they have this last discussion where Riton says, what would you do in my place for Josie? And Gabin replies, Max replies, I don't know, because I'll never be in your place. But interestingly, it was obviously felt that there was some kind of whiff of homoeroticism between the two men, which isn't really the case, but it is
I didn't get that sense at all.
No.
I didn't feel that way at all.
No, I don't think so at all. However, there's no doubt that this is the important relationship in the film between Max and Riton, the characters played by Gabin, and René Dary, who plays Riton. And what I find particularly poignant, and I don't know if Jacques Becker planned it, actually, I haven't been able to find out, but René Dary, who plays Riton, had a long career, not particularly well known, and he started as a child star, in fact, in silent cinema. And during the war, when Gabin was in Hollywood, for the 2 years he was in Hollywood, people tried to make René Dary into the new Gabin. So they gave him parts which were like the parts that Gabin had played before the war, but it never took off. He never became a big star like Gabin. So there's a sense of this poor man who was always considered the kind of second-class Gabin, and now plays this kind of rather hopeless friend who messes things up, but they're very fond of each other. So I think there's that dimension as well to the scene. I think it's so beautifully made that, as you say, on the surface, nothing happens really. They eat a bit and then they go to bed and brush their teeth, and that's it. So, and yet it's actually quite, I think it's quite significant and kind of heavy with meaning. And I think it's a really beautiful scene, actually.
It humanizes them as characters.
Yes.
It's not something we're getting with Joe Pesci in Goodfellas. So it really
No.
humanizes them as characters. It made me laugh too because he does all these things to, he really makes sure his mouth is rinsed out with, brushes his teeth, he switches the
Yes.
water, and then he goes in bed and lights up a cigarette while he's in bed.
When I taught the film, that always made my students laugh. When
Mhm.
he goes to bed, the last thing he does is light up.
Of course.
Uh, I think it's a really beautiful moment. Which also, this is where when they're brushing their teeth, and also Gabin brings a mirror to
Yeah. Yeah.
Trito and says, look at us, we're getting old, we've got double chin, we've got bags under our eyes. It's time to retire, So there's kind of brings back that theme about I wanted this to be my last job, but it's not going to happen.
There's that, plus there's
And aging.
I was just gonna say that's another. There's a scene at the end which we'll get to is where he's going to dial a phone number. He puts his glasses on. It's the first time you see him with glasses. It's like as if we need another reminder that
Yes.
we get it. This man's getting older.
Yes, and Madame Bush says, "Oh, you're wearing glasses now."
Right.
So the point absolutely is throughout, but also, I mean, Jacques Becker always said for him the main theme of the film was friendship, and so when you also, if you want to look at the film from that point of view, about friendship between these two men, and friendship that is so strong that he's ready to lose his Grisbi for it, then the scene of the snack and the pajamas makes more sense as well.
Yeah, it's not like it's the first time they've done this either. They're very comfortable with each other. They kind of like know the routine, other than Raton says, no, I'll
Yes.
sleep on the couch. Like, it's fine. Max tiptoes out the next morning and Raton pretends to be asleep. It reminded me of when I was a kid sometimes, if I'm going to pretend to be asleep, until it's like a game you play, but he does it for a reason.
Mhm.
Max it's time. So he takes that conversation of, it's time that we're done. We need to be done with this. We need to take our loot. We need to cash it
The
in.
fence. Yeah.
Yeah. We need to go. So the fence is Max's uncle. Now, is it actually his uncle, or is that a turn of phrase? Because he does say to his secretary or assistant, he even says something to her like,
It stays in the family.
which was a
Yeah.
little creepy. But
Very creepy.
so I imagine that is his uncle then, because he makes that comment.
He does say it. I think he means it. It's not that the character is called Uncle somebody, which could be a nickname. It's more, he says, my uncle. So I think he is, yes.
I tried to find a way to convert the amount of money this was actually worth at the time, and I got to maybe around 10 million US dollars, about 8.5 million euros. I couldn't really find exactly, but it's a good chunk of money that he's going to be fined for the rest of his life. It's 200 pounds
Yes.
of gold. He goes home, and when he goes home, his second apartment where they had slept the night before, he finds that Raton is gone. He calls Josie's apartment, and the porter answers so you call the front desk and then they connect you to the room that you're asking for. And the porter answers. At the time, Raton's being taken out on a stretcher into the ambulance that presumably we saw at the beginning of the film. It's another one of those little callbacks of, hope you're paying attention and not looking at your phone while you're watching the movie, because you need to keep up with what's going on. Josie is going to be taken as well, and then she escapes. So right after that, Max gets a call from somebody, a woman who we've not met yet. I believe her name is Betty, and invites him over. And he goes. So his best friend is kidnapped. The movie is about their friendship and how close they are in their relationship. Yet he still heads to this little rendezvous with Betty. That really puzzled me the first time. His close friend is taken. He knows something serious is obviously happening. And yet the film slows down and sends him to this woman.
To me, I know what you mean. And in fact, he does comment later on. He says, I'm a bastard, really, because, my best friend has been abducted and, look at me, instead of sleeping with this beautiful American woman, instead of helping my friend. So, yes, he's sort of having this detour. I would interpret it personally as two things. One is that this is a reminder of the genre that we are in. So the gangster movie, the gangster must be irresistible to women. So he has the girlfriend who adores him, and he completely dominates her, clearly doesn't care about her. He's got this beautiful trophy woman who is clearly a model, who was extremely glamorous and American, which I think is not insignificant. And so on the one hand, I think these are the tropes of the genre that, these male gangsters have women at their beck and call and are irresistible to them. And secondly, I think that if one wanted to read the film from a gender point of view and bearing in mind the fact that the main relationship really is between Max and Riton, one might say that we need to show them as full-blooded heterosexual men, so that there is no
no question here. Right.
No question of the fact that it's a homosocial world that they're in, but we don't want people to think it's homosexual, like the British censors who cut the pajama scene. I also think that the American woman is part of that kind of. You have to remember, for a French audience in 1954, the world of the gangster. So on the one hand, you're in the old areas of Paris, Pigalle, Montmartre, and so on. At the same time, when you see Max's apartment, for example, it's, for a French audience of 55, it's extremely modern. There's, beautiful kitchen, bathroom, the telephone. Most French people at the time didn't have the telephone. So it's, there's a sense of, we are also admiring a lifestyle that incidentally comes from being the head of a gang and having that kind of amount of money to have champagne. Your fridge is full of champagne. You have flats full of beautifully ironed pajamas, huge American cars, an American very glamorous girlfriend. And at the end of the film, when Gabin appears again with her in his restaurant, Madame Bouche restaurant, and one of the men said, "Max, you must tell us how you do it." It's part of the generic part of the story that we must admire Max, as opposed to just Gabin, for, having all this at his disposal and kind of leading this kind of life. So that kind of distracts him from the friendship with Riton for a while. But then, of course, the rest of the story is about him getting back to Riton.
He has a voiceover. This is very noir-like, to have this voiceover where we're getting into Max's thoughts. And there's two voiceovers in this section. One of them, he's saying, "Riton, you fool. How could you get yourself into this mess? I should have cut you loose long ago. I shouldn't have continued this friendship." And after he presumably sleeps with Betty, I mean, I understand it's 54. He comes back out and he's wearing his full suit again. He looks completely cleaned up and fine, but he is coming out of
she's naked in bed. At the same, yes.
Right. He's in his nice, fully pressed, beautiful suit. But the second voiceover is kind of regretful of, I got to figure out a way to get you back or to save you. And the voiceover, I thought, was a cool storytelling device that they threw in there.
Yeah. As we were saying, the Becker and his scriptwriter simplified, and the author of the book was also part of the scriptwriting team, Albert Simonin, and they really deleted a lot of stuff. So I think it's also very economically giving us information and access to. Of course, it's no accident that it is Max's thoughts that we have through the voiceover, and no other character is given that kind of, subjectivity in the film.
So the next section, he decides we got to get him back.
Yes.
Everything to me really speeds up here. Things really start happening now, because I don't know if it actually is or it feels that way, because we've just spent like this kind of slow getting to know everybody, humanizing people. And then all of a sudden it's like, I'm going to go recruit Marco, get him back, go to Josie's. We're going to drag the porter into the room with Josie and Lola, and I'm going to find out what happened.
We never really quite know why, for example, that they also go after this young man called Fifi, who is an acolyte of Angelo, but we haven't seen him before.
No, I guess he was tailing them, thinking it was going to lead us to the loot.
They suddenly semi-torture him to find out where Angelo is. So,
yeah, we kind of get to see, because Fats, or Perot, is a burlesque club owner, as far as we know, and they find out that someone's tailing them whenever they leave the apartment. Marco is kind of like nabbed Fifi, who is following them, and they bring him to the club, and they bring him to this cellar and into a random room in the cellar under the metro. I think he says at one point, "Oh, we're under the metro. No one's going to be able to hear you scream." So we kind of get to see how this guy is his own type of gangster. He kind of runs the club, and he's running. There's also running drugs out of the club too. I think I failed to mention that Angelo is providing the drugs, and he's doing these. Josie, who was doing the drugs in the car in the second scene of the film, probably got the drugs at the club.
Yes, and there's a third element, I think, of criminality, which is very, very discreet in the film, and clearly for censorship reason, and also the fact that it's not really Jacques Becker's universe, but it's prostitution. Because we only, through very, very tiny remarks, and I think on the first view, on the first screening, you could really miss it. The fact that Max and Riton are pimps, basically, and that Josie and her friend and the women, the girlfriends, the one eating with them in a restaurant, are basically prostitutes. Because they mention the fact that when Max says to Riton, oh, let's go home, I'm tired, but also let them do some work, so they can bring some money home. So when you think about it, it's quite shocking. And I think that's in the book, but I think that aspect is very much minimized by Jacques Becker.
Lola says at one point something about giving the Johns a heart attack. It's almost like not a throwaway line, but it's a line that's just said,
Yes.
forgotten, no one touches again. If you don't catch it the first time, you might miss that part of it.
When they're watching Josie and Lola dance, nominally they are their girlfriends, but we do understand then that they are also prostitutes, because Max says to Riton, the old Riton would not have waited for her, would have just gone home and then waited for her to come back much later with the money. So it's a sort of fairly, once you realize that, and when you watch the film again, it's quite clearly there. But the film really sort of glides over it, and it's one aspect of the book that's really almost not there.
I think it's a perfect time to talk about women's role in the film, and maybe even something that I know zero about, which is why we're talking to you, is just women's role at the time in France in cinema. So I made a list, one of my run-throughs of the film, of different things that I thought were slights against women, and there's quite a few.
Yes.
So Josie is slapped by Raton in the car. He doesn't want her snorting cocaine. Max is on his way up to Perrault's office, and he grabs a woman's chest and says to her, "Can I give you a hand carrying all of that?"
Yeah.
Like,
Yes.
whoa, that's a little shocking. Then a random electrician at the club is slapping girls in the behind as they walk by him, which is, why is that? Like, that doesn't serve a narrative purpose of the film. Everything is in for a reason, as we've established. Max is kissing on his uncle's assistant, even though it seems at the time the uncle and the assistant have something going in a relationship, and later when he calls to get the loot back, the assistant comes out in her night dress. He also says of her assistant, as they're hugging, he's looking at her breasts and says, "It's a pleasure to see our friends are in good shape." When he goes to the apartment, he slaps both women in the apartment as well as the porter. This morning I played it and I did it in slow motion. I think he's really slapping these people. I mean, he's hitting them pretty hard. I think that's all I have. If I missed anything, I mean, that's enough.
Of course, it's shocking because with our sensitivities today, unacceptable. But not to say that it's acceptable. It certainly is within the parameters of the genre, and certainly the book is much worse. Much worse in its misogyny. And we say, oh yes. And similarly for films like Rififi, similar also when you read the book, it's like really unpleasant. The films makes light of it, but it's still, of course, it's shocking. To me, it's a reflection of the times, that when you are you think about. And I meant to say, it actually brings me back to something you said earlier on about we didn't pursue with Fifi being sort of tortured in the cellar. Is very much for French people in 1955, definitely, and later, if you're familiar with the history of the German occupation of France during the war, it very much evokes the war years and the kind of tortures that went on, either from the Gestapo or the French collaborationist police. And very often people think of the gangster film of that period as an undercover way of evoking that period of the German occupation. You had to remember that in 1954, when the film came out in March 54, you are less than 10 years away from the war. It's very vivid in people's memory. And often in those films, people talk about coming out of jail or having spent 4 years in jail. And you could read it as a sort of this undercover way of talking about that. One of the features of the German occupation of France during World War II was the kind of imbrication of the collaborationist police and the Gestapo with the underworld. And so that the underworld, if you like, criminal underworld, collaborated. So that scene where Polo takes and Max take Fifi to the cellar, and they strap him and they start torturing him to make him talk. It is a kind of direct reminder of that. And thinking about the role of women, you could also see it from that historical perspective that the Second World War obviously changed a lot of things. It's the first time at the end of the war that French women got the vote. It's one of the last countries to give women the vote. It was General de Gaulle who did. And the 1950s is a really interesting, ambiguous period because it's both thought of often as a kind of, it's a moment of the beginning of the emancipation of women, kind of in terms of, their legal status. The Napoleonic Code was still in full force then. Women couldn't do anything without their husband's approval and things like that. And they couldn't vote. Then suddenly they could vote. And in 1949, Simone de Beauvoir wrote The Second Sex, which was the first really major feminist text. And so women in the 50s and 60s in France begin to emancipate from male domination. And at the same time, you see appear those gangster films, for example, and a lot of very noir films that are incredibly misogynist. So it's almost like there's the beginning of emancipation of women and then the backlash at the same time. So the films, in that sense, illustrate the contradictions in the culture at the time, that women are moving away from the kind of extremely patriarchal oppression. The law is beginning to change. It's going to take 20 years, but it does change. But you then see appear those films which are very misogynist, and the crime films kind of lend themselves to being particularly misogynist. So, and at the time you have like films with Eddie Constantine and films like that, which are where the women are gangster moles or cook. And this is exactly what you have in Grisbi. You have a kind of catalogue of patriarchal roles for women, of the gangster girlfriend, prostitute, the trophy girlfriend, and then the sort of women behind bars and like Madame Bouche. So to me, the film is really interesting in that, yes, it is very misogynist, but you can see it as it makes sense in the history of the time.
In the mid to late 40s, with American noir films, you start to see female characters getting a bit more power.
Yes.
The femme fatale, if you will. There are some films that are around that time, before Grisbi, where women are gaining more power. So I think going into it, I looked at the year that Grisbi was made, not taking into account the French context that you just laid out. The women in some of these noir films, and we don't have to go down this route because it's about completely different films, but they're controlling the men in the stories. They're kind of calling the shots. And The Big Sleep comes to mind.
Oh, yeah.
As one where Bacall is kind of in charge. I mean, Bogart is Bogart, but she's a very powerful decision maker and driving a lot of the story forward. Whereas the women in this story in Grisbi, they're almost passengers along with Breton and Max, with the exception of, I will say, the exception of Perrault's wife. He kind of speaks to her in a certain way, like, who invited you here? And then says, come in, I kind of need you in here. And Madame Bouche. Those two women aren't necessarily ones that are treated similarly as the other ones that I laid out here.
You're right. I think, no, this is absolutely the case. But again, Madame Bouche and Pierrot's wife are more powerful. They're older women, but they are, again, they stay in their place nevertheless. And although Pierrot's wife says to Max, she doesn't approve of their adventure.
Yeah, she says, I'm too late to start over, so you better get him back.
And incidentally, do you know the actress who plays Pierrot's wife?
I do not.
No, well, she was not particularly well known, but she had been married to Gabin when they were young. And she's called Gaby Basset. And what's very nice is that they were married, they were really young, and they appeared together, I think, in one or two films at the very beginning. And then they separated very quickly. And they remained friends. And throughout the 50s, in a lot of the films where Gabin plays this kind of godfather figure, she appears in little parts. So he brought her in sort of as a friendship gesture. So I think it's quite sweet. But you're completely right, because what there isn't in French cinema of the time, and including in those films, is a female star who has the power to drive a narrative like that. So there are important female stars, like Michel Morgan, Danielle Darrieux, and Simone Signoret, and they drive the narrative of films. But these would be, melodramas, but they still absolutely not at the same level as the male star. I mean, French cinema of that period is very male dominated. You have to wait until Brigitte Bardot to have a female star who has that power over men in the narrative. She kind of breaks the mold to some extent, but in a film like Grisbi, absolutely not. No, the women are on the margin. That's definitely they don't have an impact on the narrative.
It makes for very interesting conversation whenever you watch it and you're, whoa, shocked by some of the things, but then start thinking, well, that was 70 years ago, and just see how much things have changed in cinema and in society in general of how we accept certain actions that we depict on screen.
Yes, I think we have to accept that, and this is what always, when teaching students, so they're always saying, you really have to adopt a kind of, put your historical pair of glasses on, that it's not a question of condoning this kind of either racism or misogyny or homophobia, which are rife in the films, but to understand that this was the context in which, and it's the context in which these women had to work, and they had to accept those parts, and because that's what there was. So that's the context, definitely. I mean, as I say, obviously, it's particularly marked in the gangster film and the crime film, which are, in the same way as you would have in the Western, say, in American cinema at the same time. So they really remain male-dominated. But you're right about the American film noir had those sort of great actresses who, Barbara Stanwyck and Ava Gardner, whatever, and they had those incredibly powerful parts as well, but definitely not in French cinema until much later.
Yeah, you have to have that historical context, because if you saw the actions against women in Grisbi and put it in a film so you watch it in Grisbi and think, well, unfortunately, this is a product of the time.
Mm-hmm.
If you put it in a film of 2025, you would say that's a character choice.
Yes.
That they're trying to show us that we should not like this person.
Yes.
Whereas in Grisbi, it's like, no, we love Max.
No, we love Max.
Max is our guy.
Yeah. And then, his violent action is to slap people, where, whereas in an American movie, he'd be, knocking them out with punching them in the face. So here, the slap is like almost the maximum violence.
He's doing it from a place of, I'm just trying to get my friend back.
Yes.
So tell me what you know.
Yes.
And if I have to slap you, then I will do so.
Yes.
So he actually gets a call. Angelo calls Poirot's office, and so they set up an exchange for gold. And that exchange for gold, it literally explodes. There's grenades, there's gunfire, there's a very frantic car chase, which I thought was shot really cool. Like the camera is from the POV of Max's car, and you get the window blown out of the car they're chasing.
Yes.
It is so not like the rest of the film.
That's right.
It is absolutely like this complete 180 of what we just spent the last hour and 15 minutes watching. The gold burns in the wreck. I mean, Max is literally watching the rest of his life of comfort go up in flames.
Yeah.
Gabin's face in that moment stuck with me. He has this way about him that he can convey this quiet realization that it's gone.
Mm-hmm.
And we didn't even get into the music yet.
Oh,
but
no.
you hear that tune again.
Yes. Yeah.
That has just been ingrained in my mind. I don't know how many times they play the song, but at the end so they make this exchange, and they're going to be, they're essentially double crossed by Angelo and his crew. And Max again shows his wits. They hide. He's able to take out, quote unquote, the second car, and then they chase down, and the Grisbi is up in flames. They can't stay. Raton is shot, so they got to get out of there. There's a lot going on in a short amount of time.
Yes.
But that damn song that is just stuck in my head now. It plays again as they go. I
That's
think
right.
Max even says it's my tune. He goes and
Yes.
plays it on
Yes.
the Wurlitzer a few
Yes.
times. It says it's my tune.
Yes, that's almost the first thing he says in the film,
Right.
in the opening scene in the restaurant. And the last shot of the film is the Wurlitzer machine with playing the song again. So it brackets the film.
Yeah. I was really bummed out for Max in this last watch this morning because even though he's someone who does bad things, I still was rooting for him
No?
to be. So, I have this moral dilemma sometimes when I watch films of this is not a good person based on the actions and the things that they're saying. But man, I just want him to retire. I want this nice man to just be done with this life and retire with your gold and just move on toward the end of your life. I was kind of bummed out for him at the end there.
Because we had everything is made to make us identify with him, and it is Gabin, and we've seen him care for his friend, as you say. We've seen him give him food and drink, care for young men around him, and he essentially presented as a good figure. And the unpleasant side, the fact that he's a pimp, the fact that he slaps women quite freely, etc., is kind of downplayed and is seen in the mores of the time, is seen as a kind of, this is how they are.
How does the end of this film with this big explosion of violence compare to other gangster films of the 50s? Because Grisbi, and I'm sorry, I'm asking two questions at one time,
Yeah.
because Grisbi, in a sense, changed the gangster film in France.
Mm-hmm.
So is there a comparison with this level of violence? Is it a before and after Grisbi? Is it just the violence was the same and Grisbi just kind of decided to stick it at the end here as a big climax to the film?
I mean, in a way, you said it changed the gangster film in France. I think it's not so much that it changed the gangster film, it introduced the gangster film. What it changed was the crime film, because you had plenty of crime films in French cinema from the very beginning. And you have writers like Georges Simenon, famous crime writers who are been adapted way back from the 1930s, and comic thrillers, all sorts of films that follow the police and so on. So that tradition exists in French cinema from the beginning. And what Grisbi brings in is a gangster film that is clearly modeled on the American gangster film. The term gangster, I mean, in French, people say un gangster, so even use the word. And the crime film and the gangster film in France are often all called policier, a police film. And of course, in this film, there's practically no police.
No, only at the beginning whenever the shots are fired and they show up, and that's it. We don't see them
Hardly
again.
any. And in fact, it's a feature of a lot of those gangster films that, the police is either marginal or we are completely in the world of the gangsters. And again, that if we go back to the opening scenes, the film is telling us this is, these are the world, this is the world we're going to explore of these gangsters between, who live together in a particular kind of cafe and restaurant and nightclub, and they do certain activities. And that's the world we're exploring. And it's a world of violent men organized in kind of male families with somebody at the top. So in this case, Max. And I think this, I wouldn't say it's absolutely the first one, because there have been one or two others, but it's the first really impactful one. And then after that, there's a whole, quite a number of them. There's Rififi the following year, then Bob Le Flambeur. And all these films, of course, end badly, in inverted commas, because, crime mustn't pay, really. I think Grisbi, in that sense, follows the rules of the genre, that the heist has gone well. We don't see it, but it has happened. But then in the aftermath, things unravel and go wrong. But there is that, you're right, there's that explosion of suddenly frantic action and violence. But Becker could have ended the film with the car going up in flames and the music and Gabin saying, le Grisbi, it's all gone. But he doesn't. He then chooses to end on Riton's death, but also that quiet scene again in Madame Bouche's restaurant and playing his music. So I feel that violent action scene is, as it were, is there to say, this is part of the genre, but it's kind of exceptional in the film.
Yeah, Riton, he's gone.
Yes.
Of course, we're caring for him at his bedside.
Yes.
At the end.
But he was hopeless.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. And not looking good.
No.
And Max, to keep up appearances, he goes with Betty back to Madame Bouche's
Yes.
restaurant.
Yeah.
And as if we need, I think I said earlier, as if we need another reminder of Max's aging, he has to put on his glasses to see the
Yes.
numbers on the telephone to call,
Yes. Yes.
to check in on him. Same song plays. I think that's the last, one of the last acts of Max. The heist ends up being blamed on Angelo because it was found in his car.
Yes.
And he was found dead next to the car. So Max is, I guess,
Yes.
scot-free from the whole thing.
Yes.
Scot-free, but not any richer than he was prior to the heist, I suppose. And has one less friend in life. It didn't go well for Raton. And he sits there quietly, kind of staring off, listening to his song.
And having his favorite dish from the restaurant.
Yeah. And then the last shot, we zoom in on the Wurlitzer as the song plays. Is this the end of Max as a gangster? He was tired. He was ready to be done. Is he done with this lifestyle?
I don't think so.
It feels like a loss. Like the end of the movie feels like a loss for him rather than a win. I mean, he survived, but he lost some pretty important things in his life.
I feel it's more ambiguous than that. To me, it's both. There is the loss, undoubtedly. He's very sad about Riton's death, but it's also, he looks extremely smart. He's got his trophy girlfriend, the beautiful American woman. All the other men in the restaurant are envious of him. He doesn't look, apart from having to put glasses on, he doesn't look like a defeated character. I feel he's going to do another last job. And somehow he doesn't seem impoverished. I mean, I'd say he still has his fridge full of champagne and foie gras.
And I don't know how long this relationship with this American girlfriend will last, because he seems to have eyes for just about everybody. And his hands also go on just about everybody. And everyone seems to welcome it.
I also did wonder, and maybe I'm over-interpreting because seeing things from Gabin's point of view, but of course, Gabin at that point was famous for having had fairly long relationship with Marlene Dietrich. So he had a very glamorous foreign woman on his arm for quite a while. And then when she left him, basically, because I think partly because he didn't like the fact of being Mr. Dietrich to some extent. But he then married a woman who's a model, haute couture model called Dominique, very beautiful woman, very tall, very blonde, in a way very similar to Marlene Dietrich in looks, obviously. And so I wondered if that, the girlfriend, she, in the one sense, alluded to Gabin off screen, to the man who, even though he was no longer very young and had signs of aging, still was, going around Paris with very beautiful, glamorous, tall, blonde women.
I don't think you're reading too much into it. I think that's what gives the character, the actor, the film, that the layers that make it interesting. We close every episode. I give you the opportunity as the guest to answer that big question, which is why this film? Why does Grisbi deserve its place in the Criterion Collection?
Am I allowed to have 4 answers?
Oh my gosh, of course.
I mean, they're points that have come out in our discussion. But first of all, of course, I would say a great performance by Jean Gabin. I think it's kind of historically one of his great. I have actually said to people, if you've never seen Jean Gabin film, I would say watch A Grande Illusion, watch Pepe le Moko, watch French Cancan by Jean Renoir, and then watch Grisbi. I would say that's, if you had to choose 4 out of the 96 films he made, Grisbi would be one of them. And of course, I think he's extremely important actor in French cinema in general. So I would say that's the first reason. The second one is, I think the film, directed by Jacques Becker, to me is the perfect meeting point of auteur cinema and popular cinema. We are before the New Wave period. And with the French New Wave in the late 50s and early 60s, you see a split between auteur films and films that are considered by critics, by festivals and so on, but don't really have much of an audience, and then popular cinema. They seem to be split in, there's a big division between the two. Before the New Wave, there are films, by great directors which are also popular movies. And I think Grisbi is one of them. Jacques Becker is one of the great filmmakers, French cinema, but he achieved, in fact, he achieved sort of great success. And one of the reviews of the film at the time by Georges Sadoul, who was a very important communist reviewer, said, Jacques Becker is going to earn a lot of Grisbi, criticizing him for being successful. And of course, this particular historian and critic, Georges Sadoul, who's communist, at the time was very much against American cinema. So saw Grisbi as just a copy of American film, which, as we've discussed, is of course not at all the case. So anyway, so it's that kind of meeting point of auteur cinema and popular cinema. The third point is the music, which we've mentioned. I think this is by a composer called Jean Gabin, who was quite well known in France and went on scoring a lot of films and was well known for a kind of appropriation of jazz, sort of Frenchified jazz, kind of jazzy music, if you like. And that particular tune with the harmonica became incredibly famous. It was a big hit at the time. The use of a harmonica, I think, is very evocative. It's quite poignant at the same time as it's also glamorous. I mean, if one can say that the sound is glamorous, but so I think the music is also very important in constructing the character of Gabin. And as we discussed, it's his tune, but the tune had a life of its own outside the film, if you like. Once the film came out, it was very popular. Then the music was also very popular. And I think also, in fact, I was thinking, this film should be, maybe I should write about it. There's a collection in the UK of British Film Institute has a collection of film classics. And I wrote one on Pepe Le Moko a while ago. And I thought this film is a classic because it's both very much of its time, as we discussed, that is part of that history, the social history, as well as the history of French cinema. Is very much a film of the mid-1950s, but it's also kind of doesn't age. We can watch it today and still find it cool. Of course, the treatment of women is not cool. I absolutely, as a feminist, I'm very aware of that. But nevertheless, I think it's a film that it doesn't age. To me, that's the definition of a classic. And so it should be in the Criterion Collection.
Thank you so much for taking time to speak with me today about clearly something that is one of your favorite films. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Why This Film. My many thanks to Ginette Vincendeau for such a thoughtful conversation on Grisbi and French cinema. We will continue exploring the Criterion Collection one spine at a time, because next month I'll be joined by Chiara Maloney to talk The Breakfast Club. Be sure to follow, subscribe, and keep an eye out for the next episode.